Today, Dr. Elizabethada Wright will discuss two of her projects concerning Irish Catholic nuns and their influence on education. Dr. Wright is a professor in UMD's Department of English, Linguistics, and Writing Studies. She does work on the rhetoric of Memorial Place, as well as on 19th-century women's rhetoric. With all her work focusing on how marginalized people find voice in societies that try to silence them, most recently she has been examining the influence of French Catholic women religious, commonly known as nuns, on writing pedagogy in the United States. Dr. Wright's work outside the academy has similar goals. She has been an activist in many areas of social justice, co-hosted and co-produced a radio show on not-for-profit companies, and owned a fair trade company, Fa La Lo. Additionally, before entering the academy, Dr. Wright worked in the professional theater as a member of Actors Equity Association, Stage Directors and Choreographers Society, and Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of America. She holds a PhD in Communication and Rhetoric from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, an MA in English Literature from Columbia University of New York, and an MBA from Rivier University. And with that, I'll turn it over.
So thank you all for coming. I wasn't sure that people were going to come. And this is a little bit, perhaps, I don't know, maybe Cindy can say it differently, an unusual Allworth presentation because I have never been to Ireland. And so I am here talking about Ireland, and I am not talking about my travels, and I'm not going to be showing you photographs of the scenery, because I have never been to Ireland. I was actually supposed to go in January. I got a Chancellor's Small grant to go, and was going to go to an archive at the Loretto Institute, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But in Ireland, they have very generous family leave. And so I had planned my visit for January, and then the archivist told me, well, I'm going to be gone. And it is for an order of sisters who don't have necessarily a lot of money, so she won't be back until the summer. And if anybody knows how UMD money works, if you don't spend your money, it's gone. So I am not going to be, but hopefully I'm going to apply again and we'll get a chance to go. So anyway, so I just want to give you a bit of an overview about what it is that I'm going to be talking about. If I've never been to Ireland, then what am I doing up here talking about Ireland and the origins of Catholic information? So I'm going to first of all tell you a little bit about how this project came to be, and more or less how I came to be standing here in front of you talking about the Irish origins of Catholic education in North America. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background, and I don't usually do that because I do a lot of work on marginalized people to which I'm not a group, but I am very Irish, so I am going to talk a little bit about my background and my connections to this and several aha moments I've had within this research that I've done. Then I'm going to talk about one of my research projects, and I'm not going to talk about the research project so much itself, I'm going to talk about Mary Ward and her connections to Ireland. She was also not Irish. I don't think she herself either went to Ireland ever, although she traveled much of Europe. But I'm going to talk about her and her connections to Ireland, which are part of what my research is exploring. And then what I think might be most interesting to many people, especially those of us here at University of Minnesota, is I'm going to talk about the Morris Indian Boarding School, which is what has become the University of Minnesota at Morris. And I'm going to talk about its connections to Ireland. So that is my plan of action as we're going forward. So as a good academic, I'm doing all these research projects. The library is like my savior. I'm always like working with the library and having this. So I have two research projects that are concerned here. I like having juggling lots of projects, so I have more than these two, but these are the two that I'm concerned with here. And the first one is for a book that is, I'm one of the editors of the book, and it's an international book. It's being printed by Brill, and it's on the Ratio Studiorum, and it's about Mary Ward's Jesuit education for women. So that is one of the projects. And as you can see, that doesn't seem to be too much about Ireland either. So again, what's Ireland doing here? The second one is one that I am currently working on. I don't have a publisher for this yet, but I'm co-authoring this with the archivist at the University of Minnesota Morris, Stephen Gross, and I'm going to be heading there next week. And this is on Mother Mary Joseph Lynch and the boarding school that she established that again became the University of Minnesota. So I've been working on these two different projects, none of which seem to have any direct relationship with Ireland. And so I have them all drafted and work on them. The first one is actually probably going to go to press without the Irish discussion. I've read other people's work about Ireland. I myself have not been able to do the archival information, but Stephen Gross has some really great information about Ireland, and so we're going to be putting our heads together about that. So that's how this project came to be. So let me tell you just a little bit about myself, so who I am. So I'm a Bostonian. And I don't know if any of you know Boston well, but Boston is so Irish. Now, the thing that's kind of ironic about me doing all of this work on these Catholic sisters is I am not Catholic, nor have I ever been Catholic. I was born in Boston, which is incredibly Catholic, and I always was a little left out because I was the Protestant kid, who didn't go to CCD and didn't do all of these things. So I grew up seeped in this Catholic environment as a non-Catholic, and so that I think is kind of interesting. However, I come from a very Catholic background. I put the singular here for immigrant, and it's actually plural. My grandmothers, my mother's parents were both immigrants from Ireland, but I'm particularly interested in my mother's mother's mother, who I sort of learned a little bit about and has sort of intrigued this. And they were Irish Catholic. My grandmother was very Irish Catholic. She actually left the church. I really do think that there was some clerical abuse of my grandmother because she said things that, like, everyone at the time told her, "You can't say that, Ruth, you can't say that." And she just wanted to have nothing to do with the Catholic Church, and which is one reason why I kind of like looking at it, the Catholic Church, from a distance. I appreciate much about it, but I'm happy. So anyway, I am the great granddaughter of Irish Catholic immigrants, and I knew in my growing up that my great grandmother in particular had come over during the potato famine, which is, like, now people prefer to call it the Great Hunger. So I tried to call it the Great Hunger. And I knew that she had come over alone, a woman alone, and that she had come over because of the Great Hunger. And so I knew that was family lore, and all these different things were, so that was just part of my identity, and part of my grandmother's identity, knowing this. And my grandmother used to always talk about how she was a menopause baby. She was the daughter she was the child of, I think, like 8 children. But the age difference between the other eldest child and her was significant. And that she always, these were her words, "I'm a menopause baby." And so her parents died when she was young. And she lived with her siblings who were adults and had their own families. And so she grew up as this kind of, child in her siblings' families. And so, I always knew this. And my grandmother was born in 1904. And so I knew my grandmother was born in 1904. And then starting to think about math a little bit, like, how old was my great-grandmother when my mother was born? I mean, yes, she might have been a menopause baby, but, being 64, and even that would make her a very, very young child. So I knew the dates didn't quite add up. And I always kind of wondered, like, what's going on? Because I knew the dates of the Great Hunger were 1846 to sort of 1849, thereabouts. It just didn't quite make sense to me. I didn't quite understand. Well, doing this research, I have come to understand, and that's part of what I want to talk about, because I was fascinated by it. I didn't know this, and so that's part of what I want to talk about. So I also just want to tell you a little bit of a surprise that I learned actually about 10 years ago with all of this. But my great-grandmother came over, and again, I don't know the exact dates of when she came over, but my grandmother was born in 1904, so we have an estimate of when she came over. And she came over as an indentured servant, as many women did. I come from Irish peasants, and so she was a poor woman, and she did not have the money to come over to the United States. And so she became in servitude, and she went to work for a mill, a fabric mill in Maine. And I've also done a little bit of research outside of this on mills in New England, and they were horrific places. They were really horrible places. Many women died of brown lung, which was the fibers that were floating in the air they would breathe in. And I've done an article that's on a cemetery in Lowell, Massachusetts, and I looked particularly at one woman who died of this in the mills, and the mill worker girl was something. Well, she was a mill worker, and it was horrible, and she escaped. And that's actually one thing that has really sort of informed me a lot in the work that I also do on African American rhetoric and on issues of, of DEI. One of the big difference about being an Irish woman who escaped servitude and being a Black person who escaped servitude is that Black people were always under suspicion when servitude existed, when slavery existed. Whereas for a very white Irish woman, that wasn't always, so she was able. But according to family legend that I learned, again, only fairly recently, she spent her whole life looking over her shoulder, and she actually changed her name because that was a way for her to avoid getting caught. But she was always fearful that she was going to have to go put in the other years that she never put in to the mill in Maine. And I don't know which mill, but I have suspicions it was Biddeford. But anyway, so that's my background, and so why I'm kind of so interested in this. So first of all, I want to talk about Mary Ward, who I was just going to talk about alone, but Mary Ward is becoming, I worked on Mary Ward a lot last year, and so I'm doing the other, so this is like, I get very involved in what I'm doing. So let me just tell you a little bit about Mary Ward. She was an English woman, and she was born to a prominent Catholic Yorkshire family in 1585. And if you know anything about British history, and you know what was going on in England in 1585, that was not a good time to be a Catholic. Catholics were persecuted. It was illegal to be a Catholic. And she came from a very, very prominent family that considered themselves Catholic. And her family was actually involved in the gunpowder plot, the Guy Fawkes Day that's celebrated in England, that comes from the gun, and her family members were part of that. And her grandmother was imprisoned for her involvement in activism in England, trying to maintain Catholicism. So she came from a very prominent family and was very aware of promoting Catholicism. And so she, though, being from a very prominent family, her family thought she should marry somebody else who was Catholic and continue on this, British Catholic tradition. But she felt somehow that she should not, and she felt a call to join a religious order. And so she felt this call, and her family was not very agreeable to this at first. But then she went and she joined the Poor Clares, which was in the Spanish Netherlands. And the Poor Clares she actually had to make her living by begging. That was part of what she had to do. And so she did this. So she went from a very prominent family who were constantly hosting like the elite Catholics who were also escaping. And there's a whole lot of other things I would love to talk about how women were really important in England at this time in Catholic families, because they were able to kind of hide people, and they were doing their domestic duties, and they were able to do that, and that's exactly what her mother and her grandmother did. But she decided that she wanted to join the Poor Clares, and it was kind of a disaster because she was a very wealthy woman. She was not used to begging on the street, which is what she basically did. But she really still felt that she needed to join an order. And so she has, and the sort of are her words, she had a sort of vision. And the vision that she had was to take the same of the society. And the society is the Society of Jesus Christ, the Jesuits. And the Jesuits were a group that she was probably very familiar with, because the Jesuits in England were also in hiding, and there were many Jesuits who hid out with wealthy families, so she was very much there. But she had this calling. There's a big problem, though. Yeah?
I have a question. What is the Spanish Netherlands?
That I really do not know. I put that down because that's what all of the records say. So I know very little about the Spanish Netherlands, and that Again, with the research that we do, there are so many rabbit holes that we can go in, and this is, again, the work that I'm talking about here today is not my main focus. It's a sort of side focus, so I have not explored that, but I'm totally with you. I do not know, but I specifically put that in because everything talks about where it is, the Spanish Netherlands, and all right, so.
It's through intermarriage, and so Spain was trying to keep the Netherlands Catholic during the time of Reformation.
Okay.
They would eventually leave, and of course the Netherlands is predominantly Protestant.
Okay. Well, thank you. So, but she had this vision to take the same into society. But the big problem is the Jesuits are exclusively male, and they say they are exclusively male. So she wants to start an order for women that is going to take on all the rules and all the obligations and all the practices of the Jesuits. Now, a little side story, too, is that one of the things I've been involved with is the book that this is going to be in is a book on Jesuit rhetoric. And I'm actually have a chapter in it, unless they kick me out, which I keep suspecting they're going to, and it's on Mary Ward's Jesuit education. And at first when I was doing it, they were like, what are you doing this? There's no women's Jesuit education. But I'm making a case that there is. And they don't really like it. They don't like it. And actually, a few years ago, there was a society, the International Society for the Study of Jesuit Rhetoric, that I was asked to be a part of because of the work that I've been doing on Catholic women's work. But I was actually vehemently opposed to the creation of this organization. And I went to England when they were founding to campaign against it because I felt by definition it excluded women. And I just thought what we don't need is yet another academic society that by definition excludes women. And interestingly, most of the Americans who are joining this were in agreement with me. Almost all the Europeans and South Americans were not. And so it was very interesting. There's a lot of South Americans, a lot of Europeans in this organization. So they exist, and I'm kind of their. Some of them like me being there as sort of the rabble-rouser with all of this, and some are like, I think just I'm a pain in the neck. But anyway, so that's one of the things about Mary Ward. She was a pain in the neck too, because she wanted to take the same of the society. I too respect the Jesuits, but I don't think we should look at just the Jesuits.
Just that they are the order of the higher mind and intellectual pursuit, as opposed to.
And women can't. Yeah, women can't have higher minds and academic pursuits, you know? So anyway, so she developed an institute, and it was in the model of the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum, which is an agenda for how to go about teaching young students, teaching men, and it has been in existence since basically the 15th century, a little bit before she was born, and that's what she wanted to have. And so the article that I saw that I'm publishing or trying to publish in this is called the Ratio Studiorum for Women. There's no Ratio Studiorum for women, many people say, but she did. She developed these institutes, and they were in this model, developing the higher mind. Also encouraging sort of an international mindset, not just a provincial mindset. The Jesuits would travel. She particularly liked it because she did not want the women to be cloistered. Because if you were cloistered, you did not necessarily get to influence. And one of her plans was that she was going to spread the Catholic religion throughout England. And if women were cloistered, that's hard to do. Not only throughout England, but throughout Europe. And so she wanted women to be able to go, to speak many languages, to have the higher mind, to be concerned with that. So that's what she did. But, of course, the patriarchy was not too happy with her. I'm not going into all of the details, but basically she was condemned. She was actually imprisoned for a short period of time. She was maybe excommunicated. The church used it. Actually, sort of another side story is one of the reasons I have come to do all of this work is I used to work at a Catholic university, and when I was there, the sisters who were there kind of looked at me and they were like, they wanted some stories told, and they thought that maybe I would be a good person to tell them because they thought I was pretty, they thought I was pretty cool and I shared the same values. and I couldn't get excommunicated because I wasn't Catholic. So that's, in a way, how I started this, because they kept telling me, you have to do this work, you have to do this. And if the bishops don't like it, they can't do anything to you. And they lived in fear, and many women, and I have other works that I've done about women who were. So anyway, so she was condemned. But what was the worst part was that she had all of these institutes all over Europe that were teaching the Ratio Studiorum, were teaching rhetoric, were teaching languages, were teaching theater, were teaching all the things that the Jesuit schools were doing. And then they were told, well, you can't continue using Mary Ward's model. You can't even acknowledge her. You can't even say that you are one of Mary Ward's followers. And the founders of orders are very important. So they were banned from having anything to do with her. And so, anyway, so she went on, she continued schools, but again, it's a little bit confusing. But even though that they were banned, they did. And that's one of the things I love about the sisters that I've been looking at, is that they continually have these ideals that, not all, I don't agree with all of their ideals, but many of them I really think, and the patriarchy is like coming in their way, and they're like, they persist. And so they persisted. And in particular, there were two institutes that were sort of the dominant ones that followed her. These were not the only ones, but there was a German institute, and those of you who speak German know why I'm not going to pronounce that. But that was a German institute that was founded by Mary Ward, and that they continued. And there was in England the Bar Convents Institute, and they started as well. Now, they were not supposed to mention Mary Ward. They were not supposed to do it. But in the German Institute, according to information that I have found, they always had a few sisters who were pulled, and that they had to learn to practice and know all of this history about Mary Ward, and it was secret. And that they knew it, and then when they were getting older and it was time for them to pass on, they had to pass it on to someone else. So there was this covert passing of this information. And in England was sort of apart from things, and they didn't really know what was going on. In the early 19th century, the Mother Superior there suddenly learned, because again, all the history of Europe starts to come into play, which is all of this, but with the French Revolution and all of these Catholics coming over, and there being less prohibition against Catholicism in England, the Mother Superior of the Bar Convent learned that she wasn't supposed to acknowledge Mary Ward, and she actually had been. The whole convent had been all along. So they burned everything that they had about her. And they just like burned it. And they were like, no, and she was not a very strong person. And she was just like, well, if we're not supposed to do it, we can't do it. And she was very fearful and burned a lot of the material. So a lot of this is difficult to get. So so the ban, the prohibition, and the burning of this. But there was one woman who was, and oh goodness, I didn't write her name down, and I'm totally blanking on her name right now, but she was from Ireland. And Ireland was a very interesting place in the 19th century. Ireland had, again, we could go into the politics, and you could get all these people with, who know more about European political history talk about this. But, the prohibitions against Catholicism were being lifted, and there were a lot of wealthy Catholic families who wanted to promote this. And one of them sent their daughter to school in the Bar Convent. And one of them was there basically to learn how to model an institute that she was to set up in Ireland. And she was there at the time when all the burning happened. She was there, and she knew about this. And she was a little braver than the Mother Superior at the Bar Convent. And she brought the tradition back to Ireland. And that in Ireland, that almost all the schools, I don't know if you've ever heard of IBVM schools, but last year I went to an IBVM archive outside of Chicago, and that's the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that they were founded in throughout North America and throughout Australia, and I think Africa, by the Loretto Institute. So the Loretto Institute has had actually huge influence on Catholic education in many, many other parts of the world. Now, because they were students of the Loretto Institute, they knew about Mary Ward, and they brought the traditions. And one of the things that my research does is shows that they actually talk about Mary Ward at the time that they weren't supposed to be. They talk about what they're doing, the high education, the scholarly activity that they do. And they do that, and that was brought to the students. So that's sort of one of my arguments. And that's one reason why I'm going to want to go to Ireland, because I want to see what are in the archives from the 19th century that actually do talk about Mary Ward, because there was this sort of preservation of that information. So that's Mary Ward. Now I want to talk about Mother Mary Joseph Lynch, who was the founder of the Morris Indian Boarding School. And again, what does that have to do with Ireland? We're talking about Morris. We're talking about a place that's just, a little bit southwest of here. And we're talking about a Native American boarding school. What does that have to do with Ireland? I had no idea it had anything to do with Ireland. So I came to do this work because when I was doing all this work on Catholic women religious, and I mostly admire these women. I mean, they've done some pretty amazing things. Then I started to, when I moved to Duluth, I started learning more about boarding schools and learning more about the Native American tradition. And I said, a lot of these women have been involved in boarding schools, and I have a responsibility to tell the bad with the good. So I started to look for information, and I spent a lot of time, thanks to this library, getting material from Marquette University. They have things that they sent me, and they have huge archives that are just so huge that they're like overwhelming. And there's so little about women. There's also so little about Indigenous people. And I've actually done a couple of papers talking about the surprising lack of voice of women and of Indigenous people in this archive when we're talking about Native American boarding schools, many of which were run by women. So that's kind of interesting. So that's how but then I thought, Morris was a boarding school. So I went there and I discovered Stephen Gross, who's the archivist there, as well as a term faculty in the history department. And he just had so much information. And I said, and he hasn't published that much. And I said, I can't publish without you as a co-author because I'm just taking so much from you. Like, we have to do this together. So we're doing this. So Mary, so I just want to give you a little bit of a background about her. And I got a little picture of Ireland. This is not mine, but just here so we can say, we're going to Ireland. So she was born in Ireland in 1826 in Cork. And she was born to a religious Irish family. Again, this makes a big difference in the time from Mary Ward, because it was much more tolerant. And there was, despite the fact that we think about 19th century Ireland as being very poor, there was quite a bit of wealth. And her family came from a very prominent family. They were, I don't know quite what they had their money from, but they were not poor. They were pretty wealthy. And she joined the Sisters of Mercy in Kinsale, which is on the east coast of Ireland, in 1846. Now, again, if you're thinking about dates and thinking about major events in Europe, that's getting to be kind of important. So she joined in 1846. Now, what's really interesting about her is she, in 1854, went to nurse with Florence Nightingale. And again, this is one of the things about research, is it takes you down all of these things. And I have been reading so much about Florence Nightingale in the past few months, because I did not know this. And Florence Nightingale, when she went to the Crimean War, was there with many sisters, many of whom were Catholic sisters. 3 left from Kinsale, and one of them was Mary Joseph Lynch. It's very interesting in almost all the works that she is almost never mentioned by name, because her Mother Superior at Kinsale spoke for all of them. And there was a huge amount of dissension between the sisters and Florence Nightingale. And there's a lot of actually 19th century publications, although some were burned and some were eaten by rats, because the Irish sisters thought that they deserved the credit for sort of making nursing a female profession, and that they thought Florence Nightingale did not deserve the credit. So I'm not weighing into that. But there was a lot, they worked together, they did not get along, and that the work that they did has been celebrated. And so who's responsible for the work? That's a big issue that I never knew really existed, but did. So she returned to Ireland. I'm not quite sure the dates that she returned to Ireland, but after the Crimean War, when they no longer had the need for nurses, she returned. 3 left, 2 returned, because there was death among the sisters who were there nursing. She returned to Ireland. And then she wasn't in Ireland very long. She really wanted to go to the United States. She tried, we think, a couple of times, but she finally did go in 1859, where she went to Brooklyn, and she was there in 1859. Mother Mary Joseph Lynch was, I think, a hard person to get along with. She moved a lot, and she was involved in a lot of arguments, and there are all these different things talking about her. But she was also a strong woman, a strong businesswoman, so sometimes it's hard to tell when there's discussion about how people were, so horrible, because she just moved around. She basically got into an argument and so left Brooklyn, went to Rochester, New York, where they never really formally took her in, and then she had to leave. She went back to Brooklyn, but they wouldn't take her back. So then she went to Michigan, to Grand Rapids, didn't get along with people there, then moved to Big Rapids, Michigan, then she came to St. Paul, then moved to Mendota, and then moved to Morris. And it was in Morris, and she was involved in nursing and education in all of these places. She established hospitals and schools, some of which still exist. Obviously, the University of Minnesota Morris still exists. But she was constantly getting in arguments, so was moving around. And then she left Morris, and it was not necessarily, because nothing I can find that says it was because of her disagreements, but the federal government decided it didn't like these Catholic schools and it was going to take them over themselves, and so said, we're not going to do this. And that's a whole other issue that I'd be happy to talk about if we have time, about how it is that there was this Catholic boarding school system and how that worked with the federal government. So again, the major focus of what we're looking at is the Morris Industrial School for Indians. And it's interesting because I'm a white woman, and writing about a Native American boarding school, I feel a little uncomfortable because I'm not Native. And I know that horrible things, there are some students who died out there. There are some graves, and there's work being done to try to learn where their graves are. There were some pretty horrible things. Mother Lynch said that she only brought students there if they wanted to be there, but there's all kinds of records in the archives where parents are wanting their children back. She's complaining because they went home and they didn't come back. So clearly there was not a real willingness. And clearly she was trying to, if you know about the phrase from Pratt, to kill the Indian, save the man, at the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, that was part of the agenda here. It was to eliminate the Native culture from these students' experiences and to get them to be well-trained for industry in the United States. So that was very much a part of what was going on there. But so looking at all of this, it's like, the records are scant. And again, I'm going to Morris because I want to do this. And I did a presentation in Dublin on Zoom. I didn't go to Dublin in January, and I presented on this. And it had overwhelming response. I was really nervous because it was for a mostly Catholic audience. And I was basically saying not nice things about the Catholic Church and its involvement in the boarding schools. But one audience person actually really took me to task because felt that I was not critical enough of the boarding school, and I was sort of excusing Mother Lynch for what she was doing, and was talking about how she kind of did it out of necessity because she was a strong woman who had been floating around, and that Morris seemed to be an ideal place for her. And so I don't want to publish things and have my whiteness sort of proclaiming and make excuses. So I started talking with my co-author, Stephen Gross, and he really said, her Irish years are really important, and they really shape her. And so that's where Ireland comes into too. I want to talk just a little bit about Ireland. And I want to talk about the Great Hunger. But before we talk about the Great Hunger, I want to talk about Ireland before. And I'm not going into all of the political history and the tension between the Irish and the Protestants because that's books and books and books and books and books. But, and I hope you can see this, but I'm sorry that it might be hard to read. But there were clearly British and Irish tensions. I mean, that Biden is in Northern Ireland now, or he was yesterday, and those tensions still exist. They existed in the 18th century. They were actually not quite as bad as they had been a little bit earlier. Things were starting to get better, but there still were huge tensions between the two. The interesting thing that I learned, and I first didn't really believe this, but that pre-Hunger Ireland was not very Catholic. And I whoa, and like a lot of the articles and scholars that I've looked at this said, most people don't believe this. But before the Great Hunger, Ireland wasn't really that Catholic. People belonged to the Catholic Church, but they weren't really that Catholic. And one of the reasons they weren't is because the population of religious, and again, religious is a noun, it's not just an adjective in this context, women religious, religious is a noun. The religious were far and few, and the ratio of the population to religious, both religious, women religious and male religious, was something like 1 to 2,000 or something, so there were not very many. So people were not really able to go to church, to go and to have these experiences. So people said they were Catholic, it was a Catholic country, but it wasn't really that Catholic, which I find rather surprising. And that among the wealthy, in the wealthy areas, like where Mother Joseph was, they had the priests, but in the rural peasant parts, they were not very Catholic. And there was a real class divide. I mean, again, there was much, much more money in Eastern Ireland than there was in the West. The West is where the Great Hunger impacted the most, where most of the potato farms were. And so there was, but it was a little bit different before the famine. People on the West were poor, but they weren't actually doing that bad, according to some of the research that I said. And actually, some of the scholars say that you can tell how well people were by their heights and their weights. And in Western Ireland, people were large. They grew. The potato, which was new to Ireland, but the potato really served the poor really, really well. And so even though they didn't have much, they had big families. They had money, not money, they had food, they had sustenance. And so again, it was subsistence farming. And they were cottiers, and it was an archaic agricultural system that people really didn't farm to sell, they farmed to feed themselves. They farmed to feed their families. And what they farmed was what they mostly ate. They did a little, and there were a few industries where people were knitting and that kind of things, but it was mostly subsistence farming. Again, in the East, people were making much more money, and there was more agricultural, people selling, there was more development of industry, but that was different. And there were, again, cottage industries. People made money from knitting, from weaving, and doing all these different things. So women were doing quite well. Women actually worked on the potato farms, but they were small, they were little. They were not big farms. They were, family had their farm. Women went out and did it. They also created other money for their families, and so they did quite well. And there were other famines as well. The famine that is like the Great Famine was not the only one. There were similar famines that were earlier. They were not as devastating. So there were earlier famines. So when the famine first hit, people thought, oh yeah, here's another one. We'll get through this. So there were these earlier famines. And one of the things that's really important to know is that women were extraordinarily important in this cottier, this peasant culture. That they were farmers, they made money from their cottage industries, they cooked, they did all these things. They had large families, it was very important. And when somebody died, they passed on their farm to their children. They just divided their property up and gave smaller plots of land. But potatoes grow really easily and really well, and you can eat some potatoes and so that was working out really, really well, that subdivision. But if you start thinking about when you subdivide subdivisions and subdivide, that's where you start to get into some problems. And so there was a bit of a changing culture. And so culture was changing for a number of reasons. One of them was the industry that was coming in. So cottage industry was kind of starting to fade away, because why would I pay you a lot of money to weave something when I can get it from a factory for just a fraction of that price? Catholicism was also becoming more prominent. And so there was also sort of a pressure to go to church and to abide by certain things. So there was a changing culture. And the wealthy of the East were kind of saying to the poor of the West, you need to stop having such big families. You need to stop subdividing this. And the people were like, no, we're doing just fine. But then the famine hit. And again, because of Lynch being in Kinsdale, that's where I have been looking at most of the research. And Kinsdale, again, is on the East. So this was not nearly as impacted as some of the West were. But in 1845, there were some early problems with the crop. So they were just, again, it happened before, so it's not that big a deal. In winter of 1846, people started moving to Kinsdale. I mean, they were in the West, but they started to move because it was like getting kind of rough because those potatoes weren't doing well and there were jobs in Kinsdale. So people started to move, and it was starting to get to be a problem. You know, it was like, I can't wait for next year when the potatoes come in. You know, next year things will be better. And during this time, actually, when people started moving to Kinsdale, the poorhouse, and there were laws in Ireland that said that there was a poorhouse and people could be housed there, that the poorhouse changed from giving potatoes to the people there to Indian corn, which came from the United States, so that they had that information. So moving to the poorhouse was like kind of a good thing for some people at that time. I'm going to move to Kinsdale, and if I can't find work, I'll go to the poorhouse because I won't starve. And so that was something. And in the early days of the famine, the charities worked. There were, again, particularly in the East, there were all sorts of systems set up to help the poor, and they worked, which brought more people in because the charities were working. But the next year, in the fall of 1846, the crop failed again. And that was not acceptable. People just kept waiting, you know, it'll get better. It didn't. And then as those failed, other industries started failing, including the fishing industry failed, and people just thronged to Kinsdale. It was just like there were hundreds and thousands of people. And then by January of 1847, about half of the population of Kinsdale was affected by poverty and destitution. So it was really, really pretty bad. And the relief that had worked previously no longer worked. Nothing worked. And then there was not just starvation, there was also infection. If you're not very well, then you're prone to sickness, and so that started to make things really bad. So Mother Lynch is there for all of this. Now remember, she comes from a wealthy family, and she sees all these poor who haven't really listened to the advice of the people who say what to do, and they're coming in and they're like, you know, if only they had listened to us. And so one of the things that's interesting to me is that Ireland recovered. Basically, the way that it covered and why the end of the Great Hunger is sort of hard to tell is because it basically recovered via depopulation and emigration. And depopulation was both death, people dying, and also women not having children. So there had been big Irish families. Now it was like, don't have kids, because if you have kids, there's nothing to feed them. And so there is nothing there, and also people started to emigrate. So this had a huge impact on women, and this is where, again, this starts to come into play. So inheritance and marriage were different. Again, remember I said with the plots, the people with the potato farms would give their plots to all their children. Now you couldn't do that. What happened is you gave your money, you gave your land to the most successful son, not necessarily the oldest, but the one who seemed like he was going to do the most. And the daughter you would give your money to who could get the best marriage. And so you would try to think about what you could get as the best marriage. So there were a whole lot of women who couldn't get married because there was just nobody who wanted to marry them. And so there was just nothing that they could do. And so again, people did not want children. So there was just no desire for children. And sexual mores, actually it's very interesting learning about sexual mores of Ireland. You know, again, it sort of explains my family to a certain extent, but that's a whole other story. But people just did not have children. Do not have children. Sex was kind of taboo because if you have sex, you might have kids, and that was not. So the role of women, what do you do if you are a woman who doesn't have money for a dowry? What do you do? Well, you know, you could go out and you could get jobs, but there were not that many jobs. And the role of the church also became different, and the church became more impactful. And actually, I was just doing some research here at the library yesterday with an interlibrary loan book, and I found a quote that's sort of relevant here. This was published in 1855, and this was published by a woman named Anna Jameson. And she wrote, all the unmarried and widowed women of the working classes cannot be seamstresses and governesses, nor can all the unmarried women of the higher classes find in society and visiting literature and art and the purpose and end of their existence. And so it's like, what do women do? There's only so many who can become seamstresses. There's only so many who can do things. What do you do? And the role of the church started to become different, so many women started to join. That was actually a plea for women to join orders. There was also an increased class consciousness. If you have a lot of children, if you do this, you are going to be poor. So you don't do this. And again, with the sexual mores too being so incredibly restrictive, some people who didn't want to abide by that couldn't stay in Ireland. And so that they left and came to Australia and to the United States. So what really happened is that after the famine, women were superfluous. There was really no role for many, many women, which explains my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother did not come over during the Great Hunger. She came over well after the Great Hunger. And the reason that the Great Hunger influenced her was because she was superfluous. What does a poor, single Irish woman do? There's no work, there's no hope, there's nothing that you can do. And so she decided to become an indentured servant, signed to indentured and servitude and come. So again, emigration became really, really important, particularly to the United States and Australia. And I had the answer to my questions about how those dates didn't quite work with my great-grandmother, how she managed to have my grandmother in 1904, and so that sort of explained it. I still don't know the exact dates that she came over. I think it's probably the 1870s, but that shows how the devastation of the famine started to go. So thank you for tolerating my talk, and if you have any questions, I can't answer about the Spanish Netherlands, but anything that I can talk about. I love this work, in case you can't tell, so I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Have you been to Morris?
Yeah.
And how does it feel down there?
I'm going there on Wednesday.
Okay.
And I was there this summer, and I've been there a couple of other times too.
I asked that because I went to Sioux Falls with my family doing something with schools. And we went to a big park at the falls, and there were these historical markers, and some of them were blatantly racist against, and it is like, come and see our markers. It was like a bragging point.
Yeah.
And then it was kind of in build this lumber factory and, historical things, and then, it was really insulting racist.
Yeah, I mean, people who are at Morris talk about, Morris is this kind of liberal institute with, a large population of indigenous students, and then it's in this town that is very red, and, like lots of Trump signs, around the whole Morris area. So it's an interesting, Janet Erickson, who's the interim chancellor there, is, I think, doing really good stuff to try to make Morris more aware of the indigenous past. And the campus has, quite a bit that is about, that the sign that I put up is, from Morris. They talk about that. They're trying to find the graves of the few students they know that were buried. And so they're doing some work, but the town itself is a very different place. So, yes, sir.
Why did the Catholic Church why was it against Mary Ward?
Because she was trying to promote Catholicism, but she was trying to get women to have the same role. First of all, she didn't think they should be cloistered. Women should be able to travel. And she thought women should be very well educated, and that she was promoting the education. And she basically wanted them to have the same rules that the Jesuits had. And the Jesuits were like from the very beginning. Actually, that's not true. From the very beginning, actually, there's a lot that says that there were women that were involved in the Jesuit tradition in the very, very early days of the Jesuit tradition. However, because of concerns about sexuality and Ignatius and like things being improper, they just said, nope, no women, because there were like stories that they were having these wild, events, which were not true. Which is, sort of the sexual innuendo regarding convents has been there throughout history because, that women's sexuality fits into so much of patriarchal fantasy. And so that was part of it. So the, and it's also about power. I could go on in, about lots of situations where there were tensions. I mean, Saint Scholastica has its own, there's a narrative that exists in almost all the places I've looked at, where a sister comes, does this incredible work, does all of this really good work, the bishop says no, for some reason that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then the sisters kind of try to work around it, and the bishop says no. And then the sister gets in trouble. And that happened, I mean, I don't know enough about Sister St. Scholastica herself, but Mother Benedicta Reap, who is the founder of the sisters that are in St. Joseph, what's the school that's down there?
St. John, St. Ben's.
Yeah, St. Ben's is. She died in disgrace because she and the abbot were constantly having fights. And it was partially because they were doing such good work. And, like, you know, I mean, that's I'm a feminist, so my interpretation, you know, so they were doing all this good work, and the men were like, you can't do all this good work, you know, we need to be the ones. And, yeah.
It's not really a question, but it's, so I have a friend who's passed now, and he went to boarding school, and he lived at Fond du Lac, and he went away to boarding school. And it's just very sweet that he ran away, and it was bad, but he said that he basically dedicates his life to the one sister that helped him read and helped him research and helped him write. And so anyway,
Yeah,
just kind of,
the whole
there's,
history. I mean, I didn't go into the whole Catholic boarding school system, you know, but there was this whole, again, the archives that are at Marquette are about this, and the, you know, in the 1880s, is it? I have to look here. But the U.S. government changed its policy because its policy had been to just kill Native peoples. And so after the Civil War, many Americans were just so sick of bloodshed and so sick of all of this that the federal government changed its policy. And instead of going around and killing so many Native Americans, they adopted this policy of we're going to educate them. And there's a book called Education to Extinction. And the idea is that we're going to educate the Indian out of you, and that we're going to teach you, you know, how to behave in this white culture. And so they started to do that, and then they were doing it places like around here and about in the Dakotas. Not a lot of people, hard winters, as we all know. And so they started to tap into the religious organizations that were trying to have missionary work. And so at first they had Protestant organizations that were doing them, but again, tensions, Catholics and Protestants always there. And the Catholics were like, no, we need to have more. And so the Catholics were trying to get more schools. And that's where Lynch comes in, because she was like, I'm ready to take them. And they just wanted people who were willing to do the work. And she was willing to do the work. And the Catholic boarding schools made millions of dollars for the Catholic Church in the short period of time that they ran them. And it was just a fundraising opportunity, and Lynch is constantly looking for money and all these different things. So it was, you know, really, and the federal government was supporting the churches, again, Protestant and Catholic churches, doing this. No, there's no talk of any kind of Hebrew schools or Islamic schools or anything, just, you know, Christian schools, trying to, again, you know, educate these students how to speak English, how to get a job in American society, and to do all of that. And Stephen Gross, my co-author, really thinks that Lynch really was sincere with what she did, because she'd seen the poverty of Ireland, and she then saw the poverty of the reservations. You take away people's land and you don't let them, you know, do things, they're not going to be able to do this. And she kind of equated the two of them, and so that's what she was trying to do. I'm not, again, when you're co-authoring, you have to negotiate all of this, so that's what we're doing with all of that. Yes?
It's, you know, it's kind of, unfortunately, I'm thinking of, you know, sort of oppression within the patriarchal Catholic Church for women, for nuns, and then to adopt a model that is also oppressive in some way, you know. Do we ever get away from that?
Well, you know, I mean, people who study trauma, you know, and abuse say that, you know, the abused becomes the abuser. And, you know, that's what, unfortunately, I mean, some of the things people say about her, the more I read about her, it's like, whoa, she was a force. And her letters, I mean, I have a one piece that's called The Plea for the Contract School, boarding schools are also called, and it's incoherent in some ways. I mean, she's arguing for why the boarding schools should exist, why they're so important. And her logic is really, the one thing that's really interesting in it is that she's really talking about these women. She's very concerned with women, like the young indigenous women. And she was like, you know, like, we can't have these women. They have to come to the school or else they're going to end up with some no good Indian. And then she has, after she says that, or worse, some white destitute guy, you know, and it's really kind of interesting. So she was like really opposed to them marrying, which I think has a lot to do with sort of this Irish tradition of, like, you know, again, the Moors were starting to change, and that, you know, getting married and having a lot of kids was the way to poverty. And that she kind of saw that these women needed to get a means to not do these archaic, you know, agricultural functions, which she interpreted the native way of being, and that they needed to go get these jobs. So she had this very, you know, colonialist lens, which many people did, you know, I mean, so this colonialist lens and thinking, I'm a do-gooder, I'm going to go do missionary work, you know, but actually really, you know, imposing devastation as opposed, So thank you all very much. I'm happy to stay and talk. I love doing this, and so thank you all for coming.